Thank you very much. Yeah, so my presentation's going to give you a little bit more of the practical side of the building participation capabilities in this African context that Tally's been talking about. Just a quick reminder, that's who we are, that's where we're based. These are some of the people. We're based in Makanda at Rhodes University, but we are working across these various different nodes within Africa and with our learning sites in South Africa. So if we have a look at that adaptive systemic approach again, Tally didn't. You might have seen the sort of ghost spiral on the side, on the right-hand side of Tally's slide, and what I found was this. What I thought was quite a nice little GIF that shows you that things are always changing and adapting, and they sort of change colors and change shapes, and that's a reminder that we are working in complex social ecological systems, and that things never go from A to B. We're always going in squiggly lines. So what I'm going to be talking about is that phase 2, that section of adaptive planning process. And I do feel a little bit like I'm in the company of people that will be going, yeah, we know this. But I'm just going to talk you through it anyway, just to give you an experience, my experience of working with this adaptive planning process, which if you work in the space sometimes feels like, oh, well, everybody will understand this. It's relatively simple, but it actually isn't, and you need to be able to facilitate and manage the spaces, which with multiple different stakeholders can be quite challenging. And in the context that I've worked very often, language becomes really, really important. We tend to go into spaces or be invited into spaces and simply speak in English. And it took us about 5 years to realize, and Tally's insight, and the team that was working in the TITSA project on participatory governance, that actually most of the people that we were engaging with didn't speak English at all. They spoke isiXhosa. That's their language. So why are we presenting in a language that is not understood? And we switched to doing everything in isiXhosa and having English translators for the facilitators. And that made things a lot better because suddenly people felt more comfortable. They were actually able to say what they wanted to say in a language that made sense to them and that they could really express what was important. So the adaptive planning process is this key participatory phase of the adaptive systemic approach. It's the facilitated workshop process with a defined set of steps. Now, I know Tally said we have phases, but in this particular planning process, there are actually steps, and we'll get to those in a moment. And that set of steps is informed by this idea of epistemic justice. So it's fairness in related to the way of knowing, in the experience of being respected, and in the real possibility of contributing. And that, again, stressing that language is important. So if we have a look, this is a snapshot from the how-to handbook that Tally showed you, and Harry's Pancakes. Just a reminder that what we're talking about here is an adaptive planning process, and that's nested in the pancakes. And I'm going to talk to you very shortly about this little section of the adaptive planning process. And those of you that have worked with the strategic adaptive management will recognize some of these sort of steps that you go through as well. So it's in the adaptive planning process workshop is envisaged as the first time that as many as possible of your stakeholders and researchers engage and participate. So it's structurally informed by that fairness of knowing and learning by doing, because everybody does everything together. So if we zoom in a little bit and we have a look here, you'll remember in that ASA diagram we had phase 1 of bound. So normally by the time that you get to doing an adaptive planning process workshop, you will have engaged a little, and you might be finding in sort of research terminology that you're starting to have a snowball effect of stakeholders or participants that should be invited to a workshop. But usually by the time you actually have a workshop, it's the first time that people are going to be able to participate together. And so it is, you may have an idea of a problem or a focus area that you will be talking about during that workshop. And so this phase 2, that workshop becomes the catalyst to change thinking, because it's your first opportunity to engage in possibly a slightly different way. So how does the adaptive planning process create this experience of fair participation or power leveling? So I'm going to go through a few of the defined steps. Um, I'm not going to take you through a lot of the process, because actually we've found that trying to run an APP process workshop in a day is virtually impossible. 2 days is great. 3 days would be ideal, because there's a lot of information that comes out in those learning contexts. So we're going to get up to the context step here very briefly. And we have found that if you run the workshop in a day and you don't get to the objectives hierarchy or hierarchy of objectives, and I've just realized there's a spelling mistake there, that's the possibility that people can see where they might be able to go in the vision that they've created together. And so that's also important to stress, is that the vision is created together. So we're giving people the chance to think, to engage, to see that there are possibilities. So what we do in the concerns phase, so we've come to this workshop and there's a bit of a problem, and very often participants in a workshop have very different ideas of what the problem is. So one of the ways that you facilitate people through the process is to actually, everybody writes down their top 3 concerns. So what is their concern related to that particular problem in the space that they're in? And again, what you do as a facilitator is you then mix up the way that you select people to give their one top concern. So everybody gets to have a chance to say their first one. And you don't if somebody wants, and very often somebody will want to say all 3, and you actually as a facilitator have to stop them and say, no. Everybody has to say their first one. So you give people the opportunity to say that. And that's really important. And one of the key things is to write down exactly what the person says in exactly their words. So the temptation very often for a facilitator is to sort of interpret what the person has said. Interpretation in this instance is not an option. You write down exactly what the person says. And if you're doing this in a language that is like that, so for facilitators it's quite hard work. But what you need to do is, if you're doing this in another language, is then you encourage people to speak in their home language, and you write that down. The facilitator needs to write exactly what is said in the home language. Then, for instance, if I'm an English speaker and somebody's said something in isiXhosa, I might like to understand what they're saying as the facilitator. So there is a translation. And again, what's important is that the translation, that the person and the room understand the translation, and that there is consensus that what is translated is what the person meant. And what that does, by writing down in a room full of people all of the concerns, there is a sense that your voice and your concern as an individual in that space is heard. And quite often what happens is you do this mixed up random selection of people, and you make sure, and you very often have co-facilitators, so you make sure everybody has a chance to have their concern written up. And then very often what happens is you can start again, because we've asked for 3, we've written up 1, and people will say they don't necessarily have another one. And the realization is that you've come from different spaces, but actually the concerns are quite similar. Or there might be something that you might want to add to what someone else has said, but there's not a new concern. So that is really important. And so some of the languages that we've been using in our workshops include things like isiZulu, Swahili, French, Amharic, and Wolof from our different African country partner nodes. So you go through that, and then one of the other steps that you do is you write down people's values. And again, what this does is it puts on a board for everybody in the room to see what values are held by the participants in the space. And again, that's important because it means that it's transparent. Now we all know what we all have and what we all feel and what we have all said up for everybody to see. And then what you do is you look at the context. So where are we? And you use what we call the STEEP, or social, technical, ecological, economic, and political, to think about, to really get you to think about where are you, what are the influences, what are the opportunities and the barriers within that space in terms of things like social barriers or social opportunities, political barriers, economic or ecological. So you think about that quite seriously, and obviously in some of the areas in South Africa, and I'm sure in other places across Africa particularly, technical challenges. Zoom is difficult. So engaging in Zoom is difficult when you know that some of your participants are standing outside a building on the top of a hill hoping to stay connected. It gets really tricky. So that really meant that doing things using Zoom was hard for the ResBen project for 2 years. And by the time you've got to the end of that context, you have this rich picture that everybody has given input into, and you learn from people that you may not have expected to learn from, because everybody comes to a workshop space with their own knowledge, and by the time you've written all of this stuff up, and pages, lots of A4, I mean, those sheets and sheets and sheets and sticky notes, and anybody that's run a workshop will know you get miles of information. But it's really useful for everybody to be able to see that and to acknowledge and feel that they have contributed to that. So you don't necessarily have to do the adaptive the APP, the adaptive planning process, in exactly the same steps as written in the book. Because what we've found is that by putting the concerns and values and the context up front, you can then say to people, right, well, we've got all of this stuff on the walls. So let's think about this. What is our vision for this space as a group? And you can write down some visions. And then we always do what I call the mud puddle exercise. Tally does. I've got lots of lovely photographs of Tally doing the jumping out of the mud puddle, because we're all stuck now in this space, in this mud puddle, and there's our vision over there. So you make people get up and they get themselves really stuck in the mud puddle, and then they pull their legs out and they all jump forward into the future that they've created by working through this process and creating a vision. And you stand in your jumped out of mud puddle messy space and look at your future and look back at what you've written up and go, well, how are we going to do this? And that's where you can start building an objectives hierarchy. But I'm not going to go into that now because there isn't actually time. But what these beginning phases of the adaptive planning process allow you to do is to start sharing and understanding that your problem or your concern or your barrier may actually be the same or completely different from someone else that you may never have engaged with previously, and that you have learned together in that space by doing things together, that everybody's knowledge is acknowledged, that you have heard what people have said, and that you have made it very clear that you understand. So I'd just like to thank our funders, the UKRI, and then all of our partner universities, without whom the struggles of the last 3 years and the challenges and the ups and downs and the opportunities to shift and change would not have been possible. And thank you very much.